Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to Source Booksellers webinar. I'm Janet Webster Jones. I'm the founder and proprietor of Source Booksellers. And next to me is my daughter,
Allison
uh,
Jones Turner.
Jones Turner, who is the event manager and has really done all the hard work of putting this event together. And we want to let you know that we are partnering with four other bookstores who are independent bookstores in the country. And they are.
And that's why we call this the Midwest launch for America on Fire.
Yes.
We are very excited because Elizabeth Hinton has connections to Michigan. So here in Detroit, it's like coming home. But all the other bookstores have a Midwest connection. So we have Anderson's Bookshop in Chicago. And so we want to thank them for their partnership. Boswell's Book Company in Milwaukee, and Left Bank Books in St. Louis. Lastly, we have Moon Palace in Minneapolis. And we are very, very happy to be in this discussion today with Moon Palace and all the other bookstores. But we do notice that their bookstore was positioned next to the police station that was set on fire during the George Floyd uprising, and their bookstore was saved, and they were also they're very strong now in the community, but even then. And so we're excited to talk about this content in particular with bookstores that have recent impacts, and all of us have some historical ties to Black rebellions.
So thank you very much, everyone, for being with us. We want you to know our author and the person who's going to be in conversation with them. So it's Elizabeth Hinton, who is Associate Professor of History and African American Studies at Yale University and Professor of Law at Yale University. So she is really double trouble. So you got to listen real carefully to this person, and the author of the book War on Poverty, from War on Poverty to War on Crime, The Making of Mass Incarceration in America. And she lives in New Haven, Connecticut. So Yale is well represented here on the event this evening. She's in conversation with Robin D.G. Kelley, who's a name I have known for so long with his work. And it's such a pleasure to have his face in the square tonight with the rest of us. He is the Gary B. Nash Endowed Chair of the U.S. History at UCLA, University of California at Los Angeles, and a contributing editor to the Boston Review. He's an author of several books, including Freedom Dreams, which we also have at the store, which is Black Radical Imagination, Hammer and Hoe, which is about the Alabama communists during the Great Depression, and the wonderful book, which we've also sold in the store, The Thelonious Monk, The Life and Times of an American Original. So we have two wonderful writers, historians here this evening, and we really welcome them and welcome you to participate in this evening. Know that the independent bookstores are on the march, and we are celebrating this Midwest launch with these two eminent professors.
Also, if you need to have closed caption, it should be right below where you see the CC. You just want to push that, and the closed caption will come on for you for this event.
Question.
And if you have questions, you can either put them in the Q&A, which is the best place for them. If they're in the chat, we'll try to catch them there as well. We'll be taking the questions after the conversation starts. So thank you very much, and here we go.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, I am honored to be in conversation with Professor Liz Hinton, and I'm especially honored to be connected with Source Booksellers, which of course everyone knows on historic Cass Avenue. It's like one of the great places, historic places, you know, and I spent some time in Michigan. In fact, so did our eminent author. And so what I actually want to do, you know, I'm a little bit peeved that you've already been in conversation with Kianga, with Derica Purnell, with Mike Dyson, with Nicole Hannah-Jones, with David Blight, with Dr. Sean, with all these people. I'm coming on the late freight. It's like, and I've known you more than all those people. I've known you longer, rather, than all those people. We go back to when you were like the daughter of my then wife's professor. And so what does it mean as someone growing up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, to come to this work? And I'm asking this question in a very particular way. Like, you don't have to tell the story about like how you came to this particular book itself, the archive Christian Davenport had and all this stuff. But really, how does a young woman from Ann Arbor, Michigan become the preeminent scholar when it comes to police violence and Black rebellion?
First, Robin, I want to thank you so much for sitting down with me. I want to thank Source Booksellers, Moon Palace, Boswell's, Anderson's, Left Bank. I'm a product of the Midwest. I'm a Midwestern girl. So this launch of America on Fire, I just could not be more honored. I could not be more honored to be supporting these independent bookstores, the greatest independent bookstores of the Midwest, and Source, and to sit down here with you. I mean, so there's one answer, and that answer partly has to do with you, Robin, which is that I was, when Robin was at NYU, I was a sophomore, 19 years old. I took his Black Urban Studies class, and he said, "I'm looking for a research assistant. Does anybody want to be my research assistant?" I literally ran home to my dorm room and emailed him right away and said, "Hi, I want to work for you." Because I wanted to learn. I knew his genius. I witnessed the genius, and I wanted to learn from him. I wanted to learn how to do history. And, I didn't know, I knew that I was passionate about justice. I knew I was passionate about these issues, but it really was, I wanted to write like you. I wanted to write like Robin Kelley. So therefore I should be a historian. And that's why I chose history. So part of it has to do directly with you. And you've just influenced everyone. You've influenced so many of us.
Okay. The check is in the mail. I trust me.
But I can't thank you enough for your contributions, for your work, and also just for the care and the mentorship that you've given me through the years, because I wouldn't be able to have produced this book without you. And then I would say double on that. Robin and my dear colleague and friend, Brandon Terry, read the Word document draft of this when it was still, it was in much rougher shape than what you see now. And so, many of the best, I said this in the acknowledgement, but many of the best ideas came out of I think we spent like 4 hours together on Zoom talking about the book, and they came out of that conversation. So, your imprint has been on why I wanted to pursue history, why I wanted to become a historian, and on this work. But I think, Ann Arbor in particular was a hard place for someone like me to grow up. I think hard place for a mixed race person. I think a lot of my critique of liberalism and the racist dimensions of liberal social policy comes out of my experience in Ann Arbor and my family's experience in Ann Arbor, a town that's, seen as this like Mecca or this utopia for racial harmony that is deeply, deeply racist and segregated and classist. I was very aware of that. And also, my family, my dad's family is not from Detroit, but is from Saginaw, Michigan, which is like maybe 40 minutes north of Flint, Michigan. And so I think the contrast between Ann Arbor and Saginaw, to me growing up, we went there at least a few weekends a month, was always just very clear to me. And understanding how, the reason my dad made it out because he got a full football scholarship to the University of Iowa, and was really the only person to make it out until my cousin, who's a couple years younger than me, years later, who was able to get a merit scholarship to Western. So just being aware of always these different paths, the way that mobility works, socioeconomic conditions, but also, and I think this is one of the things that comes through a lot in America on Fire, the ways in which smaller towns like Saginaw, we focus so much on the big cities, but the stories of these smaller towns, the stories of especially, in the 70s and 80s and deindustrialization and decline, I think are just so important to understanding how we got where we are today. And so Saginaw has always been on my mind. It was on my mind through the writing of this book. And I think a lot of my attention to smaller cities and trying to tell these stories, like what happened, because to a certain extent, like we talk about, Black communities in big cities, but what about in even more marginalized places like Flint and like Saginaw, where, my grandfather literally, GM bought him a ticket in the 1940s. And after a bus driver pointed a gun at his head, he was like, I got to get out of here. He got the free bus ticket and then worked in the foundry in GM for his life and survived by the time, he died in his mid 80s, surviving on a quarter of a lung from lung cancer from working in the foundry, which of course is, the worst, the worst and most dangerous place in an auto factory. So I think these, and these stories are so key to understanding racism, the way that racism works today, how to understanding how capitalism has developed in the late 20th century. And that in contrast to my own upbringing and the privileges and resources that I enjoyed in Ann Arbor was something that, I've long wrestled with and continue, I think, to wrestle with in my work.
Right. That's great. In fact, I want to ask you about geography and class, because, one of the things that's so striking about the book in terms of geography is, first of all, you've laid out way more rebellions than we've ever imagined. We used to talk about 300 and you're talking about like 2000, right? And and when you look at it, you show that these small towns and the larger rebellions and cities are all across the country, but they are concentrated. So for example, you dispel the myth that the South was the place where there was just civil rights and then rebellions to the North. But you also showed that there were rebellions in the South, Mississippi, in Tennessee, Kentucky, Florida, but they still, in terms of numbers, still pale in comparison to especially the Midwest. Mm-hmm. So I want you to talk about, like, why do you think the Midwest especially was a place for these rebellions, number one, and number two, to what degree were these also class rebellions? In other words, that these were rebellions against certainly state violence, but at a time when middle-class Black people are moving out of urban areas into suburbs, and desegregation has its consequences in some respects in terms of concentrated poverty. So could you talk about just those two things?
Mm-hmm. So I think part of it has to do with, of course, the nature of labor in the Midwest. And, most of we really do see these concentrations in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, in Illinois, Indiana, Michigan. I think those are probably the states where the most towns rebellions happen frequently. I think part of it has to do with, again, similar to Big Papa's story, right? Where, migration routes, where jobs were opening up to Black people in these cities. And the kind of nature of factory work, but also the kind of possibilities for organizing within factories. We see this rich revolutionary tradition in Detroit, especially. That, has been celebrated, carrying through from the 1930s through the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and Drum in the 60s and 70s during the kind of height of the era of rebellion. So I think part of it has to do with the kind of nature of the industrial workforce and how that shaped migration, kind of the late labor movements and the ways in which workers organize in factories. And then also the immediately felt impact of plant closures and of deindustrialization and joblessness in these very same communities during this time in the late 60s and early 70s. I think that in particular kind of laid a cocktail for rebellion. And, in many of these places too, which we don't often talk about. We talk about white supremacists and vigilante groups in the southern states, but the very kind of strong prevalence of white vigilantism throughout the Midwest and the deep entanglement, as in the southern states, between these white supremacist groups and police departments. So we see in a lot, in many places in the Midwest, these kind of like what could be called race wars in the, in the streets between white and Black residents, reminiscent of what we saw in places like Chicago, during the Red Summer of 1919 and in 1943 in Detroit and other places. And so we see kind of a resurgence of that in the late 60s and 70s as this labor precarity is really beginning to take shape. So I think that's part of it. And of course that plays into the class question too. Because fundamentally for me, I read these rebellions as being about jobs, as being about unemployment, as being deeply, deeply tied to issues of employment, as are the problems of crime and social harm and violence. All of these things are deeply entangled. So I think
Exactly.
the political and economic transformations at this time, as well as the migration routes itself, create the kind of conditions that breed this form of political violence.
Right. And you show very clearly how the police are deployed to manage this kind of Black class rebellion. And in fact, they have new tools. New tools are coming into being, tools that are supposed to be non-lethal, but basically they're, not just crowd control, but tools that really are about riot control. And like you laid it out beautifully. And one of the things I was interested in getting you to talk about is you talked about the vigilante violence. And, you would think in theory, right, that a real class rebellion would be able to draw in all those poor white people in defense of Black communities against police violence. But that's not what happens. That's not what happens. That's like somebody's dream. Now, let's talk about what does happen, which is one of the things that I think not many people have really written about, and which is I really love about your book. These were organized vigilante groups. Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, the Klan was there, but you're talking about the Committee of 10 Million, the White Hats in Cairo, the United Citizens for Community Action. I mean, these are organized, and some of them were across class lines. Can you talk about, white organization and their alliance with the police and the role that they play?
So, especially, the two places where rebellion, where the kind of property destruction was the most, arguably the most severe of the entire era, and that was in New York, Pennsylvania, and then the most kind of protracted rebellion, which was in Cairo, Illinois, were both so extreme because of the organized white power and white supremacist groups in both towns. And I think this is something, this period too marks the kind of transition, or the full arrival of the transition from the kind of like white supremacist groups of the Klan variety to white supremacy being adopted by and embraced by the genteel class in cities. So, the political in these cities, in places like Alexandria, Virginia, so this is, Midwest and the Southern states, the political and economic, and, this is post-civil rights, of course, political and economic elites are at the helm of these vigilante groups, not the, low-income crackers, that were kind of at the heart of the Klan, right? And so this, again, makes the kind of oppression that Black residents were experiencing, both from the kind of political and economic exclusion from resources and institutions in a given locale, but also from police violence and from white supremacist violence, even more severe. In the case of Cairo, which was, and it's really interesting. You basically just set up we don't see the kind of class, we don't see race crossing the class divide in terms of like mobilizing and organizing in this period, but we do see, both poor white people and establishment, wealthy white people coming together in the name of white supremacy during this period, especially in places like Cairo. And that's why, the violence there, basically, the white vigilante groups there, which were, included people like that would go on to become mayor, the district attorney, owners of lumber yards and businesses, police officers, county sheriffs, came basically almost every white person, white man, at least in Cairo, came together and were deputized by the county government and terrorized the Black community there, including, over hundreds of nights over several years, shooting into the all Black housing project called Pyramid Courts in Cairo. And ultimately, so the Black community responded by, of course, arming themselves in self-defense and fighting back, and continuing to embrace the nonviolent tactics that they had pursued for years in order to desegregate the city and gain political and economic rights. And through the entire, through 69 to 72, which is the kind of length of the rebellion there, the Black community successfully boycotted and then led to the closure of, I think, 17 white-owned businesses, because they said, we're not going to patronize these white establishments so that you can buy bullets to shoot at us at night. And so, the violence in Cairo, and again, this is not the 50s Jim Crow South. This is the 1970s in Illinois. So the southernmost tip of Illinois might as well have been in the South in many respects, but in Illinois. And while the violence in Cairo was exceptional, it's also so indicative about how racism works in the US, and a warning to all of us, because essentially the white establishment allowed the economic infrastructure of the town and their own businesses to close, to completely tank in the name of white supremacy, rather than ceding basic rights to the Black residents there. This vigilante establishment chose white supremacy. And as a result, their own livelihoods, their own property values went down. Their kids couldn't continue to live in this town. And so this is a warning for all of us that, that of what racism can do. And there's a precedent for, there's many precedents, but this is a precedent for, again, white supremacy ultimately being the supreme choice over, policy, sharing resources and policies that would be better for everyone. White supremacy won in Cairo in the end.
Right, exactly. Okay, I have two questions. These are burning questions. I'm gonna ask one and I'm gonna ask the other one, then we're gonna open it up, I promise you. So the one question has to do with armed self-defense, which you also cover. And of course, given the recent and the ongoing commemoration around Tulsa right now, there's all this talk about Black Wall Street, but let's talk about armed self-defense, which is one of the actions. Armed self-defense and certainly mutual aid were the two things that actually happened that cut across class lines. But I want to talk about armed self-defense, because one of the things that you demonstrate, I think, is that these rebellions were unique because in many cases they were not spontaneous but very well organized. In other words, not that the rebellion was organized, but there's organization already in existence, and that armed self-defense is part of the organization. So one of the things that's unique is that for the first time, you have actual organizations who declare their role to patrol the police. You got Community Alert Patrol, you got the Black Panther Party, you got, various organizations whose purpose, in Cairo is a really good example of that. And certainly Akinyele Umoja in his book about Mississippi shows that armed self-defense actually reduces violence. Do you think that the proliferation of these kinds of organizations led to a particular kind of counterinsurgency or an escalation of violence? And does that explain possibly why they actually increase, from 1966 into the 70s? Or is that or they're going to increase anyway? Just, in other words, what do you think is the impact of this self-conscious organizing against state violence?
Yeah, so that's a great question that I haven't wrestled with in that way, quite that way before. I think, and it is true, and Robert F. Williams made that point too, that armed self-defense keeps communities safer. I think we know historically that Black people have never been allowed. The Second Amendment has never applied to Black people in the same way. And so, you know, when Black people do take up arms, and let me also say, I mean, this was a common sense, you know, in Cairo. I mean, I gave you a sense of that story, but this is a common sense thing. If you're being attacked and there's absolutely no recourse, you have no recourse for it, if you want to protect your family. And this has been, you know, this is how we survived Jim Crow. I mean, you write about this in Hammer and Hoe too. It like you take up arms to protect your family. You have no other choice. So, you know, in many ways, this is common sense. And it also, I mean, the way that I write about it in the book is that, you know, it really post Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, it really comes to dominate many of the politics of civil rights in general, because, you know, it appeared to many people, especially the younger generation, the young people, kids even, who participated and embraced this form of political violence, that nonviolent direct action hadn't worked, that conditions hadn't changed, and that now, in the context of this militarized police in the war, you know, in the war on crime, as police forces are expanding, that self-defense is the next kind of logical step, or the only, you know, necessary for protection. So of course, you know, when groups like the Panthers are very publicly arming themselves, or there's this idea, and also you have, of course, you know, returning Vietnam War veterans, which also pose a real threat. You know, young Black people are already seen as an insurgent force. And this, I mean, I think what you're talking about in terms of how this plays out through the 70s is this kind of another, you know, a cycle within this larger cycle of police violence and Black rebellion. So that, you know, the response to Black people arming themselves is that, and I write about this in my chapter on sniping, is that there's this like coordinated revolutionary conspiracy to kill police, which of course drums up support for more police in these communities, and the repressive tactics and civil liberties violations that went into the federal government's repressive campaign against the Black Panthers. So, you know, even though we know that a lot of, you know, the idea of the sniper was in many ways a kind of a fictive vision, again, that was used to justify the escalation of the war on crime. And, you know, and just like many of these crime myths and these ideas from the super predator that we see in the 90s to the sniper in this period, right? There are there was a lot of talk about, you know, this attack on police officers, and certainly there were ambushes on police. I mean, there were police killings, but it was not in the form of what policymakers are talking about, and certainly significantly less than the violence that police and other state forces were inflicting in Black communities, which aren't talked about. So it does establish this insurgent, counterinsurgent dynamic in the context of Vietnam and the Black Power movement.
Right, exactly. Okay, so our questions are piling up, but I have to ask this last question.
Yeah,
this last one, this is from me, and the rest will get from other people. Okay, so we established that these rebellions were Black and Latinx rebellions. You talk about those too beautifully. But then something happens. So you have 1992, which has a multiracial character, despite the way it's portrayed in television, right? Then you have Cincinnati, which is largely Black, but there's all these white anarchists who start to think about like how are they going to participate. And then we get to George Floyd, when you get a whole lot of like white people and others participating, and sometimes it's the white people doing most of the property damage. How did that happen? Well, what was the shift?
Yeah,
and we'll take the other question.
That's yeah. I mean, I don't know if I have a good answer for that, honestly. To be honest,
you have a great answer. You have great answers.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, so Los Angeles and Cincinnati. I mean, so I do think that Cincinnati is this real kind of transition moment from the kind of earlier rebellions, I'd say, from, you know, the civil rights era through 92 to the uprisings that we saw, you know, from Michael Brown and Ferguson onward. Both, you know, both because of the nature of the rebellion itself, but also the response on the part of the federal government to the rebellion. And Los Angeles, I mean, that the kind of multiracial character of the rebellion there is not surprising, given the demographics of Los Angeles itself, and also the shared experiences of police violence by Black and Mexican American and South and Central American residents there. So I think 2020, and so this is, this marks something different. Like, I don't know, and this is a kind of question that I pose in the book. I mean, we may not see rebellions will certainly continue, but they may not look for reasons that you say. I mean, a lot of the violence happened in white communities. The protracted struggles were in Portland and Seattle. The looting occurred not, in Central Avenue in LA, but Rodeo Drive. So it's it occurred in against luxury retailers. So we're seeing something different and distinct that we haven't quite seen before. And I think part of it has to do with a generational shift, and perhaps the mark of a coalition that's building. I think especially among young people, but people committed to racial justice, LGBTQ plus activists, climate change activists, anarchists, coming together and saying, one, understanding the ways in which their struggles are connected very clearly, and saying, this mode of governance is unacceptable. We're not going to stand for it. We don't want, the continued embrace of policing and prisons at the expense of basic needs for people, and a different set of resources that could and should be going into communities and addressing pressing issues like climate change need to be priorities. And I think, and I guess that's part of what keeps me hopeful, that that we're seeing this new coalition say, this is unacceptable, and we have to bring about a different, our democracy is unraveling, and we no longer want to live in an unequal society defined by class and racial hierarchy. It's time for us to think about how we can build a set of policies and relationships to each other around the notion of equality, which is never, which was entertained after the Civil War and in a century later, but has never really been part of how this country has governed itself.
That is true. That is true. Okay, so I'm going to go into the question. So one question that came up was, in writing the book, what was the question you were left with? In other words, when you finished, what was the burning question that you wanted to look deeper into?
So I think it's a question that I came into the book with, and I think it's still like the big question. And that's really trying to understand, and it's something that I try to deal with in the book, right? But in the post-civil rights period, especially after King's assassination and into the early 70s, this collective violence emerges in low-income communities of color, and it's directed against external forces. It's directed against the police, and then somehow, in the really beginning in the mid 1970s, but we see it taking off in the 80s and 90s, that collective external violence turns internal, turns into gang warfare, and I think part of my first book in this project is an attempt to get us closer to historicizing that social harm, historicizing that violence, because I think historians haven't, like, things like drive-by shootings have not been treated as historical questions, and they are historical. They're not just like something that just naturally emerges. And we need to understand the process through which something like a drive-by shooting would become, in some places, such a all too prevalent part of the urban landscape. And so I think that the book, so writing, that was a question I had going into the book, and then writing the book, I think I'm getting closer to trying to answer it. And so of course, that's what I, in my future work, that's one of the things I hope to do. But this story, in terms of historicizing what happened in the 80s and 90s and so-called gang violence responsibly, this story needed to be told and understood before we can get there.
Right, exactly. I know you've been working a lot for quite some time on this issue about gangs and sort of internal violence. Okay, so one question that came up was, what role has colorblind racism played in the continuation of white supremacy? And the question is white supremacy in Cairo after the 70s, but you know what? You can also think about that question in terms of other places as well.
Yeah, so I think, just like, and this has to do with it's similar to my critique of the kind of terminology that's used to describe this political violence in terms of a riot, right? Is that the colorblind, continues to obscure the larger socioeconomic conditions that are the root cause, that are the root causes of both this form of political protest, but also continued inequality. So, colorblindness, that idea prevents us, of course, from confronting the ways in which racism structures institutions and social relations in our society and continues to do so, and the ways in which historical racism has, and we're beginning, of course, to see a real backlash against the histories that are trying to reckon with some of these questions. But then it also too, ends up, like the term riot, pathologizing communities and emphasizing a narrative of explaining inequality or explaining poverty, especially among Black people, as a pathology, as personal responsibility. That's actually the term that was also coming into play when colorblindness did in the 1990s. And personal responsibility, right, that idea is not gonna effectively provide us a route to understanding how certain dynamics emerge in communities or effective policy responses to give communities the resources that they actually need, and recognize the role of white supremacy historically in shaping outcomes and resource allocations.
Right, that is so true. I thought about some of the earlier narratives explaining urban rebellions, and one of the narratives, as you know better than anyone, is the argument for relative deprivation. That is to say that, America's growing. This is the Keynesian moment and all this kind of economic expansion. And these people are rioting is because they actually want more things, and it's a form of pathologizing as well, without actually attending to the fact that there's actually deepening inequality, that the capital flight begins not in the 80s, but begins in the 60s.
Right.
That, people lose, just like you're talking about, people losing their jobs, being laid off. So even before the global slump of the early 70s, you begin to see deep downward mobility and increase, as you know from your first book, as you explained to all of us, increased expenditures on policing. Right. In the name of the war on poverty. So Anyway, that's a little preaching there. Sorry. Okay, let's go to another question. So one is, the rebellions of the late 60s and 70s took place, of course, during the Black Power movement. In what ways did the politics, ideas, and organizations of the Black Power movement figure into your analysis of the rebellions? Okay.
That's a great question, and actually something that that Robin helped me think through in the book, which is that, there is, so as rebellions are beginning to increase in scale and frequency through the second half of the 60s, I'm thinking, 66, 67, but especially, the real kind of peak years, of course, are 68 through 70. But this is a moment when there's a new language that's taking off, that's entering into kind of the Black mainstream to articulate responses to, but also an analysis of police violence. And so I think, like the use of the word pig, for instance, popularized in many ways by the Panthers, but then becomes a very commonly used script during the rebellions themselves in a way to that young people taunted police officers. So this is, again, I mean, like self-defense, it's part of a larger transition about a language that people were embracing, and a certain type of analysis about communities' relationships to police, the rights that communities had to police the police, and of course also a growing sense of militancy and pride. So this is, again, it's a new script that I think empowered many young people and made them feel comfortable in fighting back against conditions. Like, there are many quotes, not all I could include through the book, but that in cities where rebellions occurred, where older residents would kind of talk admiringly about the young people who participate. One man, I think in I want to say Alexandria, Virginia, not positive, but basically said the expression of the youngsters is a older and hidden expression of the older Blacks, who of course grew up under Jim Crow. So this is like a new generation of kids who are being politicized by the Black Power movement, and who didn't experience segregation in the way that their parents did or their grandparents did. I think especially we see the kind of ethos of Black Power coming through really clearly in the student rebellions. I have a chapter on student rebellions, and many of these rebellions at public schools across the country started when Black students demanded Black studies curriculums. They said, we want Black teachers, we want Black studies curriculum, we want to learn about Black history. And instead of, in many cities, instead of sitting down with the students saying, okay, like, how can we change our curriculum to be more inclusive? That would be what they would say now, right? The response was, okay, we need to call the police in on these protesting students. And so when the police call in, that of course only escalates the protests and the violence, and in a few cases led to police killings of young students. So I think, we especially see it in the ways in which students, and not just, we see this also in places like UCLA, just the movement in general among students to create the spaces that made possible, where me and Robin are right now. If it wasn't for these movements, me and Robin would not be here. So that's one of the legacies, I think, of this moment and of Black Power in general.
Yeah, that is so true. And I'm so much older, so because I remember being in high school in Pasadena, like after I left New York, and we had riots, and the police were called in. This is in the 1970s, so and of course, being old enough to have lived through the 60s, I was born in 62. So I have a vague memory of Harlem in 64, but I was only 2 years old. Nevertheless, it's like a lot of us have lived through these little mini rebellions, but never thought of them as rebellions, despite the fact that they have all the telltale signs: police intervention, violence as political, as a way to be heard or get something happen. And by the way, that question was from the great filmmaker Pam Sporn, who wrote Detroit 48202. Everyone knows the legendary filmmaker, my friend. Okay, so.
Thank you, Pam. Thanks for listening.
Oh, and here's another question from another legendary scholar, the great Stephen Ward. This Steven. Is for Elizabeth. It says, or Robin, but I'm not going to answer. So
no, it's for both of us.
So it says, please discuss the fact that a major characteristic of the 1992 LA rebellion that distinguished it from the late 60s, early 70s rebellions, which called the Rodney King, Latasha Harlins rebellion, was sparked not by the act of police violence, which occurred in 1991, but of the acquittal of police officers. And it's something you write about very eloquently in your book.
And I do hope, Robin, that you'll also chime in and fill in some of my gaps. But yeah, Stephen, thank you for asking that question, because that's really important. And that's what distinguishes the Miami rebellion from the earlier immediate post-civil rights rebellions, that, those rebellions in the late 60s and early 70s were in response to the policing of ordinary everyday activity. So police officers arresting a group of kids for seemingly no reason, police officers breaking up a party in a housing project. I mean, basic police work and the ways in which patrol strategies, which encouraged at that time, the heart of the strategies of the war on crime were about finding potential criminals, potential delinquents. This was the language that policymakers used in the legislation. And to do that, that meant that police officers were assuming new roles and intervening more frequently, making contact with young people to arrest them. And this, the response to this police violence was increasingly to fight back. And so beginning with Miami in 1980, rebellions only tend to break out in response to moments of exceptional violence, which is what we've seen more recently, or miscarriages of justice. And both Miami in 1980 and LA in 92 were not in response to the act of police brutality. In Miami, 4 police officers beat a young Black motorist named Arthur McDuffie to death and tried to cover it up. One of them admitted that they had attempted to cover it up and make it look like an accident. And yet they were acquitted by an all-white jury in Tampa. People were already frustrated with Janet Reno because she had failed to prosecute a number of officers who had molested a young Black girl, others who had raided Black homes or killed Black residents. Janet Reno hadn't acted on that. And she botched this case, and the community erupted in a particularly violent rebellion. LA in 1992 is the same thing. The city didn't erupt in response to the beating of Rodney King, which of course was the first real kind of viral video of police violence. I think, maybe the first time that, because the idea of course is that, or we see this time and time again, that many officials and the public, I think the white public, think that, that somehow, just like racism in general, that police brutality is like kind of the figment of Black people's imagination that doesn't really exist. It's not really a problem. And Rodney King showed that actually it does exist and it is a problem. And of course, the rebellion in LA happened after the acquittal of the 4 officers involved by a jury in Simi Valley. And so, I think this, and we know that the most recent rebellions have been in responses to police killings and seeming lack of transparency and accountability. So I think, in some ways this reflects the ways in which, and I say this in the book, that these policing tactics, both the over policing that occurs in many communities, in targeted low income communities, the omnipresent surveillance is something that has become more accepted. I mean, not welcome, but bitterly accepted. And rebellion becomes this powder keg where where that everyday police, where those incursions, where, in the case in Cincinnati too, those fines and fees, those stop and frisks, the raids, all of that. And then the miscarriages of justice accumulate into an incident or a series of incidents that will spark the community off. Like Robin said, I mean, it was Rodney King, but it was also Latasha Harlins and the lack of justice for a Black girl who was killed by a Korean store owner over a $1.35 bottle of orange juice. And that's more or less what we're seeing today. I think, one of the differences is that so many of these protests emerge in response to the videos of the police killings, again, providing a kind of a proof of the brutality that Black people have that we know has been going on for decades, for centuries. But that I think the George Floyd video in particular, all nearly 10 minutes of it coming in the middle of COVID, when people were at home and glued to their television sets and emotional for a number of reasons, I think, really sparked, was the one to spark the mass mobilization and the protest movement that we saw last summer.
Speaking of the protest movement last summer, so there's a question from Sonia Caraval, the great organizer, who is asking about, to what degree is the response the language of the unheard, which is always a response that the left, and others, the world, when it comes to these kinds of rebellions. How is it useful, or is it another way to understand these? And I want to make sure I understand, part of your argument is that this is political violence.
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore, to say the language of the unheard is a little bit vague. It's very powerful, but there may be more to it. And so part of the question is like, how do we imagine the response as something more than just the language of the unheard in order to understand the response to the George Floyd murder and everything that happened?
Mm-hmm. So I think, I think that quote in the context of King is important and powerful, and also, part of King's recognition of the essential role of the threat of violent protest and rebellion and the success of his own branch of nonviolent direct action protests. But I think, we in labeling this protest political violence, it's really about not just like, I guess it's, my response is, okay, and let's actually hear what people, what is bringing people to embrace these tactics, because they feel they have exercised all other options, and they feel as though they are locked out of political and economic institutions and resources, and this becomes the most in some ways expression of protest, logical expression of protest in the absence of or having exercised other options. So I think part of it is if we're using that to kind of recognize that there's something maybe more to this political violence than pathology, then we actually have to contend with lack of jobs, unemployment issues, housing precarity, educational inequities, lack of health care. I mean, the list goes on and on of the reasons why this, in certain moments, this form of political violence comes to the fore. So, I think we can't, if, it doesn't stop there, that opens up then ways for us to discuss some of the socioeconomic and systemic issues that are the root cause behind all of these incidents, and of which police forces in marginalized communities and low-income communities of color end up representing the most kind of tangible expression of systemic racism and inequality.
Right. Excellent. Okay, I've run out of time, so I'm going to be selective here. This is a question from the great, amazing Melanie Bush, amazing scholar, activist. She says, thank you for your work. Could you speak to the role of women and also to intergenerational collaboration in your findings?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And hi, Melanie. It's been a while since I saw you, but thank you so much for listening. It means a lot to me that you're here. Yeah, so I mean, in the earlier period, I mean, women are at the center of the rebellions. I mean, either as participants or as being the kind of violence directed against Black women, especially being one of the kind of moments that could easily spark a larger community response. So, one example in Peoria, Illinois, when a young Black mother was pushed by a police officer during a scuffle, the community responded, again, thinking about self-defense, by fighting back and protecting her, which led to several days of rebellion. Similar things, same city, actually, a year later, when a Black mother was evicted from the housing project, the Taft homes, residents came, the police came, moved their stuff out of the apartment. Residents came, moved the baby crib and her belongings back in and said, no, we're not standing for this. And this ended up leading actually to a rebellion that caused severe property damage within the housing project itself. So of course, many of the participants were women. And I think because of the kind of unique and extreme forms of violence that Black women confronted, and that and the forms of police violence that they confronted, these incidents very often led to or could lead to larger episodes of political violence. In terms of intergenerational, I mean, I think there was, it depends partly in location, but there was a lot more cross-generational participation, I think, than has been recognized. And especially, older adults and kind of the civil rights establishment and the Black church played a really important role in organizing and launching a sustained movement and placing demands on the city in the aftermath of rebellion. Taking the demands of the young people who participated seriously and seeking to use the rebellions as an opportunity to secure rights for the community.
I think that's actually so correct. It's amazing. I think about the Black Manifesto and James Forman and that whole movement, and how, whether it was intended or not, ended up making links between churches and grassroots movements in the streets around the claim for reparations. But that's not my question. Okay, so we got 2 minutes, and I don't want to leave without hearing from the great Rich Feldman of the Boggs Center, who has I think a terrific question to end with. It's like the perfect question, which is, how have rebellions and resistance to police violence and the organizing created opportunities for visionary alternatives? And he says something about freedom dreams, but whatever. But visionary alternatives to like what people confront.
Right.
And I would love to hear your answer to that question.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear yours too. So I hope that you will. Please take the last word on this, Robin, because you should have it. Yeah, so I think this goes back to the governance question a bit, and I think this is really what like defund and abolish, which have come to kind of the fore of many of the protests and the movement for racial justice are all about. It's about bringing, it's about not only envisioning, but bringing into actuality a different kind of society, one that's based on love, one that's based on care, one that empowers communities, one that invests, again, a different set of resources into communities, that doesn't look like an outside officer with a gun or surveillance equipment or a prison. And I think, that's one of the exciting things that we saw last summer. In some ways, like that movement has sped up, that, abolition, defunding, divesting is about creating a different kind of society, one that's not based in white supremacy and racial hierarchy, and oppression of groups that are marginalized, but again, that's based on community care and love, and an equal distribution of resources in the wealthiest nation in the world.
Well, you took the words out of my mouth.
No.
Abolition. I mean, basically a world without police, a world without ghettos, a world without poverty, a world without state violence, a world without violence, period.
Yes.
And that's what we're striving for. And I think that's great. And the one thing I would just add to that is that, and you do this well, historically, there were experiments at trying to do that. And when we think about the Black Panther Party, we always talk about like how many people killed. But one of the things that the party tried to do was create an alternative to policing. Imagine it. And even if they couldn't implement it, they were trying to figure out a way to create a democratic process of public safety and care, and doing something as basic as helping people pay their rent as part of what it means to have a safe society. So I just want to thank you, Liz, Professor Hinton.
Thank you so
for
much.
This amazing book, for this conversation. And I'm expecting everyone to buy it. It doesn't make sense to be here without buying the book, and use it kind of as both a body of historical knowledge, but also as a manual to figure out like, where do we go from here?
Well, thank you both.
Go ahead.
Thank you both for we want to remind everyone to pick up your copy if you haven't already from
Anderson Books in Chicago, Boswell Books in Minneapolis.
Left Bank Books in St. Louis,
Boswell Books in Milwaukee, and
Moon Palace in Milwaukee,
in Minneapolis.
in Minneapolis.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Minneapolis, Chicago, Detroit, Milwaukee, St. Louis. Those are independent bookstores, and we will welcome your patronizing those stores and to buy the book, this wonderful book, America on Fire. And thank you very much to both of our scholars and historians this evening. And know that bookstores are the anchor of the thought of a community. And even though we may differ from place to place and have a different look or a different, we really do anchor the place of thought in concert with the libraries. And so libraries, bookstores, we're joined hip to hip and neck to neck and voice to voice. And I thank you for bringing this book to us. It is a marvelous research and understanding of what we have experienced between 1960 and now. I was in on some of it, but I was really understanding what we had experienced. Thank you.
And I just want to say the collection of the rebellions at the end of the book create even more questions. And and it's a marvelous work. And we're going to keep the conversation going here for sure.
Yes, yes. And shout out to S1 Bookstore in LA.
Yes.
And make sure that all of you don't buy this book on Amazon. Go to your bookseller. Do not buy it on Amazon. Go to your bookseller. Thank you.
And we also want to say for S1, they're Bookstore of the Year.
They are the Bookstore of the Year.
We love them very much.
Yes.
And we're happy for that.
Yes. Well, thank you again. Thank you to all who have participated this evening. This was a rich and vital discussion, and let's keep it going. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Source. Thank you, Robin. I appreciate it.